We are better together.
All new Pacific Mornings with Will on 531 PI.
It is 10 minutes past 8 o'clock. You're listening to Pacific Mornings on 531 PI. I'm William Terite. It's great to have your company. Thank you so much for choosing to wake up with us this Friday. Let's turn our attention to COP29. Now, it's no secret climate change is the greatest threat to Pacific Island nations and indeed the world. So that's why many had high hopes for COP29. But boy, it was the only way in which I can describe it, and I've been saying it all week, is that it was a monumental disaster from my perspective. Joining me for more on this, though, with her own perspective, is Greens co-leader Chloe Swarbrick. Very good morning to you.
Morena.
Hey, thank you so much for your time to have this important talanoa. Your assessment generally first of how you think COP29 went?
So just to give some context, this is my first COP that I'd ever been to, and I'd been told by a number of people to treat this as a learning COP, to get to the ropes and to understand how such a surreal, bizarre international institution actually operates. Many people had informed me, it's far from perfect, but it's unfortunately the best that we've got at the moment. So you have to see how it works and do what we can. But at a base level, my key takeaway was just how deeply unfortunate, unfair, and unjust it is. The presupposition that we have to continue with effectively the economic status quo, which not only deeply entrenches the exploitation and extraction that we see in our economy, but also the inequalities. So I think the fact that wealthy countries who have historically made that wealth off the back of, exploiting labour out of the now what are called kind of global south countries is deeply unfair that was not meaningfully acknowledged. But it's the same kind of thing that we see play out locally, right? Where we normalise the fact that these inequalities and injustices are just the way that things are. And I saw that play out on the international stage as well. And I think that's the key takeaway, that actually, as long as we treat justice as charity and as something that is open to discretion and choices as opposed to a moral imperative, then we're on the wrong track.
Before this interview, I was thinking, where do you even start with this? Because there was problem after problem at COP29. But I want to start with the host nation, Azerbaijan. Weird comments made by the leader in terms of, basically praising fossil fuels. I mean, what do you make of that kind of rhetoric as well?
Yeah, so this one, look, firstly, I think it does need to be acknowledged the fact that that the host nation, as was actually amply held to account by many in civil society and also by some of the independent news outlets that were there, it's effectively an authoritarian state that has built its wealth off of petrochemicals. However, my understanding of those comments from the presidency actually is kind of related to the fact that, as I understand it, they were the first country in the world that developed kind of industrial scale oil rigs. To give you some context of that occurred in, I believe, 1846, which is just quite a wild insight into the history of the world, right? 6 years after Te Tiriti o Waitangi was being signed in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we had the development of the first oil rigs on the other side of the world. So I think that there's a deeply kind of intertwined historical and cultural background to those comments. But as you say, on the backdrop of a COP, of a climate conference that is supposed to be moving towards phasing out fossil fuels, because, while we're talking here about this COP being focused on climate finance and getting us out of this mess, the best way to get out of that mess, or at least to start, is to stop pouring fuel on the fire, because ultimately it's going to cost more if we continue to do that as well, not to mention the untold human suffering.
Certainly, and then something that just continued to come out of this summit time and time again, at least through news headlines across the globe, was just how disorganized this was. Did you get a sense of that yourself?
I had been told, to be perfectly fair, by a number of people that that's kind of how it would play out, that negotiations would be falling out at last minute and that timeframes would be moved and shifted. It was also pretty bewildering, the fact that, as I understand it, speaking to many in civil society, including many from Pacific Island nations, there was a far bigger kind of clampdown on activism and civil society at this COP than there has been at those in the past. I, of course, have no personal experience to kind of contrast or contextualize this with, but just to give you a form of insight into what that actually looks like. Those who are looking to do a form of activism, to make a demonstration, to try and make a point about something that might not necessarily fit within a country's narrative, had to schedule those protests. So it was quite a bizarre and surreal thing to watch, as somebody who comes from, being deeply involved in activism here in Aotearoa, to watch how activism has to be scheduled and effectively as part of the system in an environment like that yeah, it really does prompt a number of questions. And for me, it was so deeply, unfortunately, metaphorical to watch people who cared so deeply about these issues and knew so much about these issues, these researchers, these scientists, these academics, Indigenous peoples, community leaders, who were making this plea to wealthy countries to do things fairly and justly in terms of the transition. And all of these people in suits just streaming and walking on past them, effectively ignoring those protests. And if that's not a metaphor for the current state of the world, I don't know what is, Ihua.
Yeah, that's so true. And look, we had some people over the past few days talking about COP29, and the thing that came about time and time again, and you said it yourself this morning, is that it's not great, but it's the best we've got, which is actually kind of sad in itself. Do you think that there were any tangible outcomes from this meeting?
Yeah, and I actually just would go even further than that. I mean, I saw some Pacific Island leaders, making it pretty blunt that they saw this effectively as a betrayal. And I think that that's a pretty fair reflection, for people who, and for a world that has watched what's termed the global north, i.e., the countries that have made their wealth off the back of this extraction and exploitation of people and planet, and are kind of turning their backs on the countries that are seeking to effectively develop and to have that same kind of wealth and saying, no, 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 don't you develop like we did, but also we are not going to deal with those inequities and that unfairness and that injustice that's been created. As
Mm.
to the efficacy of kind of decision making, I think that this is where I really actually would like to link this to the mobilization and the hope that I have seen actually locally here in Aotearoa. With the hipoi arriving at Parliament, and I know that there's been estimates from the official of around 42,000, but I tend to take the view of the people on the ground of approximately 100,000 there, the largest mobilization in our country's history. And having been involved in the Tāmaki Makaurau part of that hipoi, I can tell you that I, in my 7 years in politics, have never felt the kind of sentiment that is converging where people are understanding that economic injustices are deeply interrelated to the climate crisis, are deeply interrelated to the lack of respect and honouring of Indigenous wisdom and Indigenous peoples, and therefore of the justice that flows from that. And that realization cannot be the start and the end of people's engagement in politics, because the key takeaway here is politics belongs to those who turn up. Those institutions, whether they are locally in the form of our parliament or our councils around the country, all the way up to international institutions like the United Nations, are a function of those who participate and those who do not participate. So while I think that absolutely an observation could be, and it's very much mine, that many of those institutions are built to flatten and to carve off the edges of people who are seeking to change them. That in fact, people turning up unapologetically and organizing and mobilizing en masse to change those systems is the only way that we are going to be able to get change. It is not enough just for us to say, this thing isn't good enough, therefore I'm not going to participate in it, and I'm going to sit on my high horse or my ivory tower and just kind of throw stones. We have to change it, because the reality is that if we don't, then it continues to perpetuate all of those issues and actually not resolve these problems for us. So we either create something new or we do change this system. And I do get a deep and profound sense of hope when I look around at people who are mobilizing and growing this awareness within our communities.
Mm. Let's put it into the New Zealand context. Okay, so COP29 has happened, disastrous. Again, my own opinion. Our climate policy at the moment by this coalition government also could be characterized as disastrous. I mean, what do you make of New Zealand's stance at the moment when it comes to climate policy?
Yeah, I mean, well, firstly, actually, just to relate it specifically to COP29, this being the loss and damage, the climate finance COP is, we were looking at moving from that $100 billion that was kind of plucked out of the air at COP, I think it was 27 in Egypt, and the kind of barely inflation adjusted $300 billion figure that we've got to at this COP, which notably is not all grants, which it should be if we were merely looking at actually just those basic inequities, but it's also nowhere near the, I think it was 1.3 trillion that was being floated by a number of African states, which is what would be a kind of fair baseline figure. All of this really speaks to the fact that, again, these economic inequities are just kind of continuing to compound here, and that we're not getting to the meaningful kind of place that we need to be. But I think, again, if we are to transform this system, listen to the youth, listen to the young people. There were some amazing Pacifica rangatahi who were advocating for making these changes at the Moana Pacifica Pavilion, Moana Blue Pavilion. But if I can actually just even give you another sense of metaphor as to how I believe this institution was set up to fail, my mate Todd Henry, who was actually on the Tongan delegation, was speaking about how on the first day that he arrived, he saw a beautiful metaphor for just how this institution was set up to fail. And it was somebody who was in crutches, who was approaching the kind of squiggly line to get up to the front door, where actually nobody was lined up at that point in time. And you had a security guard posted, who the person in crutches asked, could I just cut to the front? And the security guard goes, no, you have to weave your way around, even though there's nobody in there. And that is just a case in point of how systems are built without any meaningful rationale or understanding from the security guard. Probably doesn't know why he's being told to tell people to curl around that squiggly line. But nonetheless, that's what he's been told. That's how the institution and the system operates. That is not serving him, nor is it serving the person in crutches. And it actually isn't meaning that we're getting any different kind of outcome than if we were just to take a more common sense, values-based approach to how to get to these kinds of outcomes, right? So this is where I always come back to that basic point of the people, the people, the people. These systems are designed to have regular people switch off and disengage, which only entrenches power and wealth in the hands that already have it. It does not need to be that way.
How do you not get discouraged from after attending such events where it's like, is it an empty pursuit? I mean, I look at these big nations that were there, walking away from it, effectively, washing their hands clean of it. I mean, how do you not get let down by it? You know what I mean?
I'm hugely let down by it. And I think that anger should be precisely the motivation to action, because if we are not acting, then we are giving up. And this is where, the Pacific Climate Warriors chant of "we are not drowning, we are fighting" must come to the fore. There is an imperative for survival. There is an imperative for a humanity that I think all of us who, believe that we can do better must fight for. Because if not, what the hell is the point of any of this? And this is actually the cool question that I ask whenever we have government budgets that are passed, which refuse to deal with as a result of the political willpower, the deeply entrenched poverty, which results in all of the other social ills that we see play out in the forms of incarceration, in the forms of homelessness, in the forms of lower academic achievement, in the forms of people's unemployment or underemployment or lack of joy in their life. What are we all working so hard for? If not to improve society for our fellow human beings so that those that come after us do not need to deal with the same kinds of issues that we are. And there is no way that we are going to tackle these issues if we continue to isolate and individuate ourselves. And this is where, again, if we are to look at and contextualize Aotearoa as a nation within the Pacific, which we have responsibility to, but also more so that we have these deep cultural connections to, then those concepts of kind of community and identifying yourself as part of the bigger whole should come naturally to us. But that is the antithesis of an economic system that causes all of us to see each other as competition, to be torn down and to fight against, as opposed to working together to create a better system. This economy is not natural. It's man-made. The inequality that we have, the existential crisis that it's created in the form of catastrophic climate change, those are not natural phenomena. They are the consequence of human decisions. Different human decisions can be made. They can be a really depressing thing to realize that human beings in power have created these issues, but it also can be an incredibly liberating thing for us to realize that we can be each other's liberators if we work together.
Just one more final question for you before I let you go. Apologies, it is taking long. Look, I mean, it almost feels as sometimes the language, and I'm meaning more locally from our coalition government particularly, I've heard the likes of drill baby drill, or, this type of rhetoric where you just feel as though you're heading towards an apocalyptic world is the only way in which I can describe it. What do you make of that type of sentiment that's currently being pushed at the moment?
Yeah, and apologies, Will. I actually completely missed the opportunity to really have a go at the government before in your question. Just to be really straight up, this government's policies, vandalism is terminology that falls short. Irresponsible is terminology that falls short. Betrayal is terminology that falls short. What this government is doing is knowingly pursuing policies that will increase climate changing emissions and therefore the suffering and the devastation that's not for future generations to worry about anymore. Sure, absolutely, it will have an impact on them. But think back to the Tāmaki Makaurau flood that we had at the beginning of this year, the thousands of people that were displaced, the people who literally lost their lives, the whānau whose lives and livelihoods were turned upside down. Right now, we have a government that is knowingly making decisions that has all of the evidence in front of us to exacerbate and to make that worse on the fallacy of this notion of economics, which is made up. This is the thing that blows my mind more than anything. We have members of this current government who belittle arts-based and humanities education on the basis that they're soft and waffly and apparently won't contribute all too much, which I completely disagree with, by the way. But economics is more of a humanities than it is a science. Yet the hard scientific fundamental truths that we know about the planetary limits necessary for human survival are being treated as though they are negotiating points, not the literal parameters for humanity and the existential survival of all of us as we know it. And I could point to the ironies and the lack of evidence and everything else, but what it really boils down to for me is the lack of political responsibility based on this really bizarre notion of so-called personal responsibility. But here's the thing, if you are simply to point to personal responsibility when you're looking at a crisis and a challenge as big as the climate crisis, to use another metaphor, is basically just the ultimate group project. You know, when you think about it at school and everybody's got to do a group project and meet a timeline, well, if, you know, somebody at the last night before it has to be handed in has to finish the damn thing. It doesn't matter if they do 90 or 100% of the work or everybody does it equally and fairly. The thing has to be done and handed in. Well, the ultimate group project is our survival on humanity, as humanity on this planet in the form of climate action. And the reality is that if we do not achieve that, then we're all screwed. We all have to share this planet together. But ultimately, it is the wealthy countries that should be doing their fair bit in order to ensure that we get to that place of that just transition. And that's where, yeah, I think that currently our current government's lack of action is not only an abdication of responsibility, but just, yeah, an utter betrayal and something that I think that all of us need to be conscious of, that they will only get away with if we let them. Politics belongs to those who turn up. And politics isn't just about political parties. It is about power. It is about resources. And it's about who gets to make decisions that saturate and impact and shape our daily lives. And my call to action for all of your listeners, well, whether they agree with me or not, is to get involved in politics, because otherwise decisions are taken and made on our behalf. And I think that that is the most dangerous thing of all, and the kind of political system that we've ended up with now, which just satisfies absolutely everybody.
Couldn't agree more. Hey, thank you so much for your time. That is Greens co-leader Chloe Swarbrick. You have a good rest of your day and weekend when you get to it.
Yeah,